Welcome everybody to this month's webinar. This is Elizabeth Earline. I'm Senior Director of Research and Programs here at the National Health Council, and I will be moderating today's webinar on observer-reported or proxy-reported, is one better than the other? So just a reminder that this is a webinar for our members at the National Health Council, as well as other folks who are interested. The objective of this series is really to build capacity amongst members of the patient community on topics related to patient-focused medical product development. As many of you know, we've been doing a series on clinical outcome assessment specifically for more than a year now. All of those webinars are available on our website. And for 2020, we shifted the focus away from more narrowly focusing on clinical outcome assessment, and now we'll be focusing more broadly on all kinds of different topics related to patient-focused medical product development. But we will continue to focus on clinical outcome assessment, and in fact, that's the topic for today's call and webinar. The objective for the webinar will be to introduce the term proxy-reported outcome and to ensure that audience understands the differences between patient-reported outcomes, observer-reported outcomes, and that might be a caregiver-reported outcome, and proxy-reported outcomes. We want to make sure that folks are familiar with these different terms because we really don't want to have ambiguity when talking about measuring outcomes for patients who can't respond for themselves, or really want to make sure, in particular when folks are going to be working on research in this space that's to support medical product development, FDA will want clarity on use of these terms, and so we want to make sure that there's a resource out there to help everybody understand what the differences are, and also why it can be pretty confusing. So just a reminder that clinical outcome assessment is an umbrella term, and FDA defines it as any measure. It's something that measures a patient's symptoms, overall mental state, or the effect of a disease or condition and how the patient functions. And recall that in FDA language, COA tells you something about how a patient feels or functions, and it can be a patient-reported outcome measure, it can be a clinician-reported outcome measure, observer-reported outcome measure, or a performance outcome measure. And so again, the focus for today will be on observer-reported outcome measures. And just a reminder that if you have questions during the presentation, we will have everybody besides the speakers on mute, but you're always welcome to submit a question via the chat function on WebEx, and here the arrow points to how you access the chat function. And you can go ahead and just submit any questions throughout. We will save the questions until the end. And if we have a lot of questions, we may need to follow up with some of those by email as well. And without further hesitation, I would like to turn it over to our guest speakers. We will have Laurie Burke, who's the founder of LORA Group, and she's formerly the director of the Study Endpoint and Labeling Development Division at the Food and Drug Administration. And Laurie will be providing an overview of the lingo and introducing the topics from a regulatory and methods point of view. Then I will turn it over to Grace Whiting, who's the president and CEO at the National Alliance for Caregiving, as well as Ryan Fischer, who's the senior vice president of community engagement for Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And Grace and Ryan will highlight experiences that they've had at their organizations, as well as lessons learned from the exciting and interesting work that they'll be describing for us today. So I think it's going to be a great webinar, and I'm very excited to turn it over to Laurie.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Great to be with you today. We can go right to the first slide. We're going to be talking about caregiver-reported versus proxy-reported outcomes, just like Elizabeth was saying. And They are not the same. I'll answer these questions for you. They are not the same. They are different. Many people think that there are lots of gray zones in the nomenclature of different buckets of outcome assessments. And I can tell you from my experience at FDA that the definitions that I'm going to be discussing today are very much not overlapping. They are mutually exclusive terms. So it's important that we fully understand what each term means, because it matters if you want to have the outcomes be used to support medical product development and regulatory review. So I know that's not the full universe of the use of outcomes, but on the other hand, that's the perspective I'm speaking from today. So clarity is so important, and evidence is required to support what you say you're measuring. And so that is part of the reason why proxy is considered different from caregiver. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So I'm going to refer to the definitions, and I encourage you to use this resource as your go-to place for outcomes, for an outcomes glossary, because it's updated regularly by FDA and NIH. They work on this together, and it can be found at this link. And it's called BEST because that stands for Biomarkers, Endpoints, and Other Tools. And it is formulated by a working group at both FDA and NIH with representation from both agencies. Next slide, please. And one of the definitions you'll find there is the definition of clinical benefit. This is very important because this is a regulatory term. Products that are marketed in the United States must demonstrate clinical benefit. And a clinical benefit is a positive, clinically meaningful effect of an intervention. That means a positive effect on how an individual feels, functions, or survives, those are familiar terms to us that are in the healthcare field. And that is what clinical benefit. If it doesn't measure how patients feel, function, or survive, then it is not a measure of clinical benefit. It either has to measure that directly or it has to be a validated surrogate of those things. Next slide. So how patients feel, function, survive can be found in all types of outcomes. And not all outcomes, however, are useful to determine whether or not a product has clinical benefit when reviewed by FDA. Now, our umbrella term that Elizabeth mentioned is clinical outcome assessments. And here it's the green oval circle in the middle. And clinical outcome assessments, as defined by FDA, are those that provide evidence in a clinical study of how patients feel, function, or survive. So there are clinical outcome assessments in many other types of outcome assessments, but not all of them are going to be acceptable for regulatory use, which is why you will not find economic impact in the clinical outcome assessment bucket. You will not find caregiver impact in the clinical outcome assessment bucket because FDA would never approve a drug on the basis of what that drug does for a caregiver. This is evident in something like a child with ADHD, and the drug really can have a beneficial effect on how the caregiver feels and functions. However, that is not the basis for drug approval in that condition. There are health-related quality of life measures that may fit under clinical outcome assessment, but then there are others that are less useful, and we're not here to talk about all that. But within clinical outcome, next slide, within clinical outcome assessments, then you can find the 4 buckets of measures that Elizabeth already told you about. I just want to bring your attention to the fact that proxy-reported outcomes do not appear anywhere in these 4 mutually exclusive buckets of outcome measures. Next slide. So I'm going to look at these definitions now, as I said, are from the BEST website glossary. And a patient-reported outcome is a measurement based on a report that comes directly from the patient. And I have added the red font to what I want you to be sure and notice. And so directly from the patient, it doesn't come through anyone else. It has to be from the patient if it's patient-reported. So, and a patient-reported outcome is not amended or it's not interpreted by anyone except for the patient. And the patient response is directly captured in the outcome assessment. So a PRO can be measured by an interview as well as by self-report, as long as that interviewer records only the patient's response and doesn't add anything to it. Symptoms or other unobservable concepts known only to the patient can only be measured by PRO measures. Well, this is a real conundrum, because if a patient cannot respond for themselves, how are we going to learn about symptoms? The answer is we cannot. We can only report on what we observe. And that's the point of having the caregiver-reported outcome bucket, the observer-reported outcome bucket that includes caregivers and other observers. Patient-reported outcomes, of course, can assess functioning just like and activities that may be observable by others and reportable by others, but they could not give the patient's feelings about or interpretation of those activities. So it seems like it might be a gray line, but it is really a very bright line when you come to think about it. Patient-reported outcomes are only those things that can only be known by the patient must be reported by the patient. Next slide. Thank you. So the observer-reported outcome definition is a measurement based on a report of observable signs, events, behaviors related to a patient's health condition by someone other than the patient or a health professional. A health professional, a clinician-reported outcome, which is another one of those buckets, they also are observer-reported, but we put them in a different category because they are there are some judgment, some expert clinical judgments and impressions that are included in what a clinician-reported outcome might include. But they could be exactly the same as the observer-reported outcome definition, outcome assessment, but because they can also add this judgment or other impression to them. We put them in a separate category just for how to develop them in terms of the evidence needed to show that they're valid and reliable measures. So OBSROs are those that are reported by a parent, a caregiver, or someone who observes the patient in daily life. That's why they're so useful. There's many things we have to know about daily life. You can't just record what happens to the patient when it comes in to the clinic to see the clinician. So an OBSRO measure does not include medical judgment or interpretation like ClinRos do, and they do not include proxy-reported outcomes. Next slide. So what is the definition of proxy-reported outcomes? A report by someone other than the patient that reports on patient experiences as if he or she were the patient. That's the word proxy, meaning you're going to stand in that person's place and provide a report as if you are the person you're being a proxy for. It's not an OBSRO. So proxy-reported outcomes are discouraged when measuring concepts that are only known by the patient. And in instances where it's impossible to collect valid and reliable self-report data from a patient, OBSRO is the option for getting daily activities and functioning concepts included as assessments in a clinical study. Next slide. And I guess I shouldn't let it go without saying the reason for that fairly hard stance by FDA is that a proxy-reported outcome cannot be valid because it's impossible for the proxy to actually know exactly what the patient would say were that patient able to provide a response. Observer versus proxy measures. So I'm going to give you some examples just to drive the point home. Signs and OBSRO concept might be signs and behaviors related to acute otitis media. So what does the caregiver, the parent, see? They see the infant tugging on their ear. You might see fussiness. So the OBSRO measure might ask the caregiver to please rate how fussy your child has been today on a scale. Please rate how much ear tugging you observed today. A proxy concept would actually be the symptoms of acute otitis media. And we have seen questionnaires that do include these kinds of questions, like how severe was your child's pain from the time he or she woke up until right now? So that observer, particularly if it's a parent, may feel very comfortable answering a question like this. However, it cannot be truly the child's feeling of pain because that parent or caregiver must rely on what they observe. What are they observing to make them think that the child is in pain? And that's what should be recorded, and that's what FDA will be looking for. Why did that parent think the child was in pain? Another question might be something like, please rate your child's tiredness over the past 24 hours. What has the observer observed in order to be able to conclude that the child is tired? Next slide. Another example, atopic dermatitis. Signs and behaviors would be blood on the child's skin or on bed sheets. Symptoms would be, how often did your child itch today? So if you watch a child all day long, you might be able to answer the question, how often did your child scratch today? Well, that, however, would even be very difficult to have a camera on this child. And there are other ways of trying to monitor scratching with devices that monitor activity and things like that. So those could be valid ways of measuring how much scratching occurred, but the actual itch is not knowable to anyone but the patient themselves. Next slide. That might be my last slide. Oh, no, there's other examples of useful concepts that OBSROs can include. Counts of seizure episodes. These have to be things that the observer would likely notice and be able to count, or be able to record in some way. Food refusal is one that we've seen in infants with eosinophilic esophagitis. Behavior in the classroom is a common OBSRO. Teacher-reported outcome assessment in ADHD treatment. So with that, you have my very hard stance from the regulatory perspective on these definitions, and I'll turn it over to you. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Laurie. And I will turn it over to Grace to discuss the National Alliance for Caregiving Experience and lessons learned.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I just have to give a shout out to Eleanor and to Silke for the work they did in getting us organized. And I'm just excited to be speaking today with all of you about this topic. So if you're not familiar with us, the National Alliance for Caregiving was founded in the mid-90s, and we conduct public policy research on family caregiving across the lifespan, as well as advocacy work. So we do advocacy work on the Hill. We work with a grassroots network of caregiving advocates and coalitions, and we're the founder and secretariat of a global coalition known as the International Alliance of Carer Organizations. Next slide. So I want to start here with Wolverine to help you understand how we came to this. So I was at the movies. I'm a huge nerd. I love X-Men, and I was watching the movie Logan that came out a couple years ago. And in that movie, Hugh Jackman, who plays Wolverine, and if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially a superhero type movie. And he's caring for his mentor, Professor X. And in this universe of superheroes, Professor X is older and he's got a neurological condition, and of course, because he's a superhero, every time he has a seizure, there's an earthquake because, you know, magical powers and whatnot. And anyways, I was watching this and thinking like, oh my gosh, Wolverine is like literally picking up Professor X and transferring him from a wheelchair to the bed, and I can't believe it, but this is a caregiving movie. And I was just sitting there sort of elbowing my husband and like, look, it's about caregiving. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought there is so often that we may not even recognize someone as being a caregiver in a clinical situation. And what's the likelihood that Wolverine is going to raise his claw and say, well, I've got something to contribute to this process. So if you'll go to the next slide, I want to talk you through an example of something that we see. I started lurking in the back of these different presentations, and I would ask people, well, how do caregivers fit into clinical trials? And one of the things that came up again and again was caregivers and providing information on pain. So this data is from AARP, and it looks at caregivers. It's from a study that looks at the types of medical nursing tasks that caregivers conduct. And this is specific to pain management. And you can see from their survey data that you've got 8 out of 10 caregivers that found it very stressful to try to help someone manage their pain. And about 4 in 10 had difficulties in really controlling the pain, and more than 4 than 10 had concerns that they were giving the right dose. And you can see below that sort of the breakdown between men and women, men in blue and women in red. And they're not only having challenges getting access as the caregiver, but they're worried about how much they're giving a family member. Is it too much or too little? And those kinds of stressors, not to mention the other stresses of just trying to care for someone in your life, can impact the delivery of a medication, and it can impact the type of data and the way that a caregiver reports out. So if you go to the next slide, I want to tell you a little bit about what we decided to do with this. The other thing people kept saying was, oh, well, when I say patient, I mean caregiver. And I kept sitting there thinking, but they're different human beings, right? These are two separate entities. And it's really important that we identify that they're two separate entities in order to protect the integrity and the voice of the patient, and in order to recognize that a caregiver, as a member of a care team, may have insight or new information to offer that we wouldn't recognize otherwise. So in order to really take a look at this, we partnered with a coalition called Leaders Engaged on Alzheimer's Disease. And in partnering with the LEAD Coalition, we hosted a multi-stakeholder summit in November of 2018. And then following that summit, we worked very closely with Kim McCleary, who is a subject matter expert in patient engagement. And she compiled the discussion that we had at the summit into a report, and that report came out last May. And then following that, we've been providing comments to the FDA about caregiving for guidance 2 and guidance 4, as well as providing comments to the Hill with respect to the new proposals for the Cures 2.0 legislation. So if you'll go to the next page. One of the things that I think Laurie did such a great job just walking through this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But one of the things that we were curious about is where is it that a friend or family member might fit into this scheme of clinical outcome assessment. So go ahead and next page. So as we talked about it and we thought about all the feedback we'd gotten both in external meetings with stakeholders and in our summit that we did that November, was really mapping out the balance of patient voice and caregiver voice. And I have to give credit to Deborah Lappin at Faegre Baker Daniels, who came up with these original conceptual models in some work she was doing on a program called AD PACE. So you can see here that the person with dementia is in the dark blue, and their voice is louder at the beginning stages of the disease when they're asymptomatic. But as time goes on and the disease progresses, their voice gets quieter, and the caregiver moves from an observer position to more of a reporter, and even sometimes acting as a surrogate or proxy. Now, I know that regulators would say, no proxies, but you will see in some guidances and some regulations where this line is not always black and white, and people don't have a lot of understanding about what the differences are there. And I'll just, not in clinical trials, but in practice, at CMS, for example, there's a guidance that says that if someone has advanced dementia, their caregiver can fill out a depression screening tool on their behalf, which gets into these questions about subjective versus objective. If you look on the next slide, you can imagine the reverse situation in pediatrics, where a child, as they get older, becomes better able to report what's happening to them, and the caregiver's voice gets quieter over time. But that transition, particularly between being an adolescent to an adult, can be really difficult for a lot of caregivers. And on the next slide, we have the third model we've been thinking about, which is chronic care and remitting relapsing diseases. So it could be a mental health issue like schizophrenia or an autoimmune disorder like IBD. But in these situations, you see the patient and the caregiver, they sort of step in and out. It's more of a wave than a true, progression in one direction or the other, and that also creates challenges in understanding how families need to navigate that. On the next slide, we talked a little bit about the report and just, the background of the report, and if you'll skip ahead to the next one, we have recommendations. So we created recommendations not just for those who are innovators and working to create new drugs or devices, but also for patient advocacy groups. And we've bracketed those out into the different stages of drug development. A couple of things I would just highlight that I think are particularly important: developing COAs or clinical outcome assessment tools that are relevant to the caregiver but still patient-centered. I think when we look at phases 1 through 3, really thinking about the benefit-risk trade-off perceptions and how a family member or a friend might have a different arithmetic when it comes to how much risk they're willing to take. And I think that's a really important piece. I heard a rare disease presentation once, and one of the advocates, who was a father of a son with Duchenne's, said on a panel that if there was a drug that had a 50-50 shot of either curing his son or killing his son, that he would take that risk. And that's the kind of thing that you look at and you really think, how do we account for how a parent might approach this, or a wife, or an adult child, versus what the person might want, even if they have dementia or cognitive impairment or some disability that makes it difficult for them to be able to express their subjective wishes and desires. On the next page, we also have a couple of additional thoughts in terms of what might make sense in the regulatory review process. Many externally led meetings do currently have caregiver engagement, but I think the idea of the caregiver being a different partner in care and the type of insight that might be unique to the caregiver, that is still evolving. And then in post-approval, I think really helping people understand barriers to access or adherence and how these social and behavioral determinants of health can impact the delivery of care. So, you know, we can have the best protocol in the world, but if people can't get to the facility or they don't understand how to use whatever it is they're supposed to do, that's a huge challenge. So that's just the highlights of some of the things that we're interested in. And I have to say, thank you for having this conversation and for engaging with us. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Ryan.
Thank you, Grace.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. My name is Ryan Fischer. I'm with PPMD, and I'm going to speak a bit about our own experience with patient and observer-reported outcomes over time. You know, we as an organization have had to evolve our thinking in this area a bit with data collection, and like many are continuing to refine how we look at collecting data directly from patients and caregivers who are taking care of their loved ones. I think prior to FDA coming out with more guidance in this area, we as a patient community sort of lumped everything together into one big bucket of patient-reported outcomes, regardless of who is answering. And we're learning that the distinction is important to make and to understand as we collect this very important information from our community. You can go to the next slide. Just a little background. We've been collecting data through our registry now for over 12 years, called the Duchenne Registry. It was established in 2007 in collaboration with Emory and the CDC. It's the largest patient-reported registry globally. For those not familiar with Duchenne, Duchenne is a pediatric onset progressive muscle disease. And really only in the last 15 years, and Grace kind of touched on this, we've been able to extend the lifespan into adulthood for patients, with many living into adulthood due to advancements in care management. So our paradigm is really shifting. And even with that, for the vast majority of participants in our registry, it's caregivers who are reporting on their own child. And so it's been a challenge for us to bring those young adults into the registry to begin reporting for themselves. As most of our data is reported from caregivers, the questions are really related to healthcare and medical interventions and what tests are being done and standard of care visits. So those aren't necessarily patient-reported outcomes in the traditional sense. They're more so on what's happening in their general healthcare. We do have validated PRO measures within our registry because we think that patient registries are really a good testing ground for the use of some of these PRO measures. This is outside of a clinical trial, but it helps us better understand the instruments that are being used. And you can go to the next slide. I'm going to concentrate on one of those instruments that's based on muscle function that we're utilizing in our registry, and this is with the Pediatric Outcomes Data Collection Instrument, or more popularly known as PODCI. This is an instrument that is actually most often used in Duchenne pediatric trials to date. We have the most data coming out from this particular instrument, so we felt if this is being used in trials themselves, well, we ought to understand it better and utilize it within our own registry. And you go to the next slide there. So here's just an example of questions given with the PODCI that related to really activities of daily living. The questions use what's called a Likert scale. For the observer, in this case, the caregiver, to respond to how easy or hard it is for their child to complete a certain activity. These are the type of questions we actually put in our own Duchenne registry for patients to respond, observers to respond, and some patients to respond to. And the next slide, But it's important to note that there are limitations with some of these instruments that are currently being used. And for us, we saw that, it is difficult for an observer to report on level of pain. That's one example where they're not necessarily the child themselves, so they're not provided with the right information to answer this type of question. And then the other example I show there is we've had families complain about the line of questioning that is not relevant or meaningful for their own child, and in this case, these are questions related to sports. The family felt like this does not really capture what's happening in their own lives, and for lack of a better phrase, felt silly to be answering. So, while there may be some face validity concerns with the PODC, and I'm certainly not saying that it's all wrong and it's not good for our population, we've just been able to see and look really closely into it of what makes sense within the PODC and what's really applicable to our community. And what we actually see is that the functional measures, those questions related to ambulatory ability, are much more meaningful when looking at our population. And you can actually go to the next slide, where we've worked with researchers where we do see, when they look at the data, that mobility-related PRO scales within the PODC are sensitive enough to look at differences in functional mobility. Here you actually see UC Davis shows that the PODC measures do lend clinical meaning to changes in functional abilities on what's called the 6-minute walk test. They took data from a natural history study. This comes from Drs. Craig McDonald and Eric Henriksen, and they compared two specific PRO instruments, the PEDS-QOL and the PODC, to changes in the 6-minute walk test, a hard endpoint. And it does show that the PODC measures the change over time. Now, there's an obvious limitation with the PODC for our community. That's where the 6-minute walk test is limited to those patients who may be ambulatory, leaving out a large segment of the population. And you can actually go to the next slide. Because of that, we're trying to support as an organization a few different efforts through academic partners to develop newer measures for our entire population. One of those efforts you see here is by that same group I just mentioned at a UC Davis. This is being led by Eric Henriksen, where he's been working on the development of what's called the DMD Lifetime Mobility Scale. And this tool will really enable continuous scored metric for individuals regardless of ambulatory status or whether they're an observer or the patient themselves. And he really used a community-engaged approach to develop this instrument. It's still underdeveloped right now. And the point would be that regardless of where you are in progression, there would be a way to measure against activities of daily living and be able to correlate those with the outcome measures being used in clinical trials. This type of instrument could also be used in our own patient registries so that there's some consistency of what's happening in data collection across the full sort of drug development ecosystem. And the whole point being that these have been developed with patient advocates and patients ensuring that they're patient-centric and that they're meaningful at the end of the day. So, part of the point of this is an evolving thing that patient groups should be a part of and make sure that they're on the ground floor developing them. So the next slide is the other project we're supporting right now is with Chad Heapwall, who's developing a health index that is based on both quality of life and function. Chad has already done work in the muscular dystrophies. He's done work in myotonic, and he's had the PROs qualified and validated. And here we're funding the development of the observer-reported outcome measure, and MDA is funding the development of the patient-reported instrument. And Chad is currently conducting interviews with members of our community in order to move to the next phase of development. But again, patient advocacy is at the table, ensuring that we're providing feedback as this process moves along. So my last slide says just some of what we've learned from our experience. Of course, we have seen that these PROs lend clinical meaning to changes in functional ability, and they can help provide that context to really understand what's happening over the course of the disease and how a treatment may be impacting that course, and looking at things that are meaningful. It gives these PROs and these observer-reported outcomes give meaning to those outcome measures that are being performed within a trial, and that patient registries can serve as vehicles to test these PROs, and that they serve an important purpose in that process. We have learned that adult participation, and Grace touched on this before, that, I had a young man say to me, we're the generation you've been waiting for. Now it's time to listen to our voice. And as an organization, PPMD has been doing everything to incorporate that voice into all aspects of our mission and make sure that they're being heard, and development of proper PROs is part of what we're looking to do. So I think for all of us, this has been a learning experience as the FDA guidances have come out, because my hat's off to the FDA for the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative and the ability for patient advocacy to be more involved in the process. But my advice to my fellow patient advocates is to learn the vernacular, learn the rules of the road, and if you're going to have a seat at the table, understand what's happening, and the definitions really, truly do matter. And as an organization, PPMD is investing to support efforts to develop better fit-for-purpose measures for both patients and caregivers. I think that was my last slide. And I think I finished in 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Ryan, Grace, and Laurie, for your presentations. I'm happy to open it up to folks who would like to submit questions for our speakers. As I mentioned before, you're welcome to submit a question through the chat function, and I'll read it aloud. So one of the questions that came in during the presentation is, do you draw any distinction when the proxy has been designated by the patient when they still have capacity versus a caregiver or family member who does not have that designation?
And can you specify, is that, who
Sorry,
is that?
I think it's certainly open to anyone, but perhaps, Laurie, did you want to tackle that question first?
Sure. I'd have to say that in all likelihood, if you're going to FDA to ask about a new outcome assessment for a clinical trial that is being designed and will soon be enrolled, then FDA will tell you that it doesn't matter, that they want you to use an observer-reported outcome measure where the assessment is based on responses to observations, not to how the patient feels, even though the patient designates a proxy to answer how they feel for them. That would, and here we need to make sure we fully understand the difference in definitions. An interviewer, if it's a patient who can still respond for themselves, and the observer is really only asking the questionnaire and filling in the responses for the patient, then that's not a proxy-reported measure. That is a patient-reported measure, because the patient responses appear in the assessment. So, if the patient is well enough to be able to designate a proxy, FDA would say the patient is probably better, well enough to complete an interviewer based assessment. Of course, it should not be too long, but that's the case for all outcome assessments, really. Patient burden, the burden on the reporter has to be considered. So now, in the scenario where the study's already done, a very dramatic treatment effect has been observed. The results are statistically significant beyond any doubt. There might be an approval action based on that study, even though it was a proxy report for a patient. Proxy was reporting. I can't say it would never happen, in other words. It all depends. But they would never tell you that it's okay to go into a study, partly because you don't know what the study results are going to be. And if you end up having a study where the comparison between the two treatment arms is just barely significant statistically, then FDA is left with this question of whether or not there really and truly is clinical benefit. Does the patient actually feel and function better on this treatment? And that's where this would be a problem, because they could not be sure that the patient really does feel better based on how that information was captured by the outcome assessment. I mean, I'd like to, well, I have an example, and I have animals, and anybody who has animals, you take them to the vet. I had a dog with very serious knee surgery last fall. It was very painful, and I knew that dog had pain. And if you wanted, and actually this work is going on with veterinarians. They are very good at making observations and conclusions based on what they observe. And I made some bad decisions based on just observations, making assumptions about what the animals actually feel, and it turns out to be something else. So, this is the whole reason why it's important to make sure that we really are measuring something that is true and valid, and not based on some person's impression that perhaps may not be based in a valid assessment.
And Laurie, this is great. I would add on to that, when we look at conditions like dementia or rare disease, or anything with a lot of medical complexity, uncertainty, and a high risk that someone is going to pass away, in many cases the caregiver has some type of anticipatory grief. So it's not that I mean, of course you do have situations where the person and the patient, the caregiver and the person who's got the condition may just not agree on the course of action, but there are other cases where the caregiver is grieving or is under stress, and so that's driving their decision making. And so to the question specifically about designating with a proxy before someone loses capacity, well, when your parent is able to tell you what they want before the dementia progresses, your relationship as the caregiver is still going to change. So somebody in early stage dementia and late stage dementia, those are very different situations, and something like anticipatory grief, anger, shame, and so forth increases as that disease progresses and the strain becomes greater on the family. And so it's not that the caregiver doesn't understand the feelings or wishes of the person, but that there is strain that the disease puts on the family that may impact their ability to be able to provide care or to be able to represent those wishes in the midst of that big cloud.
Completely agree, and I believe it was Ryan who said that they are doing a lot of work in the development of these measures and getting a lot of input from a lot of caregivers across the range of patients in their the population that they serve. And that is another very important point that we didn't even get into here. How do you do that, and how do you make sure that you have gotten adequate input from the full range of not only the range of patients with the condition or disease of interest, but also the range of caregivers for those types of patients? It's a very complicated task to make sure that you have gotten adequate qualitative input from these caregivers to be able to be sure that you are asking your assessment tool has the right content to be able to fully capture the experience that they need to report in some sort of a treatment trial.
Thank you both. As you were speaking, I was thinking about how many layers there are to observer-reported outcomes, and thinking about, developing one where we've got the umbrella of observer, which could refer to a caregiver, or it could refer to a teacher or somebody else. And then within that, you have very different types of relationships and closeness of relationships between potential observers to the patient. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that complexity, and perhaps even touch upon how prevalent are observer-reported outcomes in terms of use in medical product development or in labels. And I'd open up that to anybody of our speakers.
Well, I'll start with by saying that it's very prevalent, because anything that's approved for children, or particularly young children, or for people with conditions where they can't report for themselves, or for conditions where the patient might think they can report for themselves, but it's not a valid way of thinking, like in many psychiatric diseases. For example, schizophrenia, or something where the patient is not, the diagnosis that the patient has actually makes them not a valid reporter of reality. So it is very common, and it is a very critical area that needs a lot more experience and guidance to help people be able to do this in a well-defined and reliable manner.
Yeah, and this is Ryan. For us, what has made a lot of sense for us for the observer-reported outcomes are things linked to activities of daily living. So under that function bucket, when you think about feels, function, survives, being able to report on what their child is or is not able to do was a bit more straightforward than some of the other things that may perhaps be linked to quality of life. We actually see data in our community as the young men with Duchenne lose the ability to walk and they're able to be in a wheelchair. They would report that their quality of life increases because they now can get around and do things, while their caregiver may report that their quality of life decreases because the burden on the caregiver has increased in many ways. So these things are tricky, and for us, we're trying to sort of go through this and say, well, where can we lend the most support and understand what sort of measures are most relevant to our community and what things are meaningful. And I think we're trying to take this one step at a time.
Thank you. As a follow-up, Grace, I know that you shared a resource that's very helpful for understanding context and lessons and ideas about caregiver observer outcomes, but I was wondering if any recommendations come to mind of additional resources that folks who are interested in learning more about this topic come to mind.
Well, I would say it's a bit of an emerging topic, although there's been some externally led patient-focused drug development meetings and individual communities that have done a lot of work around caregiving as well as for their patients. And, Ryan's organization is one, and there's a handful of others. So I think a good place to start is the FDA's website and looking at those PFDD meetings that were externally led that have come before and some of the related papers. The other thing I would say that we're doing at NAC is working on a literature review of where caregivers have been included in the clinical trial process for drugs or devices. And then the third thing I would say is it's still, I think some of these concepts are still emerging. I mean, in many ways, we're still at the beginning of the conversation about what patient engagement should look like. And I think caregiving is starting to get more attention, certainly, but understanding sort of the balance of voice, we're a little ways off on that. So there's an opportunity, I think, for groups to think it through and take leadership and shine, because right now it feels a bit like a pioneer type space.
Thank you. And let's see if we had any final questions. No. Well, with that, I would like to thank our speakers so much for your presentations. I think that this was really, really a very helpful webinar and discussion, and we really appreciate your time. The webinar was recorded, and it will be posted onto our website in just a couple of days. I also would like to announce that we have our next topic as part of this series. It will take place on March the 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be on what is the role of patient-reported data in outcomes-based contracts. So we're excited about that. And Grace, when you mentioned the lit review, I thought, come a couple of once that's ready, that may be another topic as well, because I think that that sounds very interesting as well. But in any event, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.